Phil Christman, welcome to the Gravity Commons podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, excited to chat with you about this book. But first, I think it would be great, and you do a little bit of this work in your book, but by way of introduction, maybe for the context of our conversation today, tell us a bit about how you grew up and your Christian, maybe some of your Christian formation during that time.
Yeah, so I'm a Midwesterner. My first book kind of talks about that a lot. Midwest Futures from 2020. I grew up. I think we could fairly say working class in the like almost dead center of Michigan. Like we were 3 miles from the geographical middle of the mitten. Like there's a marker and everything. Um,
Hmm.
and I grew up in the I grew up it, what guess I think is a fairly typical like Gen X evangelical with shading toward fundamentalist childhood. Uh, so, I'm like too old to have read the Left Behind novels when they were coming out, but like the I just got the like Thief in the Night, Distant Thunder movies instead. You know, kind of the same thing. Um,
Nice.
and I attended Calvin College in the late 1990s, which was actually, I mean, that has a reputation which it mostly deserves as a pretty conservative school. But compared to where I had um, family like relatives, not my immediate family. They knew better, but I had relatives like telling me I should go to Bob Jones. Um,
Mm,
so
wow.
Calvin was a huge breath of fresh air for me.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, I think I say somewhere in the book like I nobody used the term deconstruction in the sense that it's commonly used today at the time, but at the time when I was actually sort of rethinking my Christianity and am I an evangelical or what how much of this am I going
mhm,
to buy and how much of this am I not going to buy into. But I feel like I did a version of that like 8 to 10 years before everybody started
mhm,
using that term.
Hmm.
But what I deconstructed into was just being a Christian, but
mm,
you know, like a mainline Protestant who actually believes this stuff, basically.
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Well, you use a word in your title that had Matt going crazy on his social media. You say leftist, and Matt took a poll on social media a while back after he got your book, kind of asking people like, "What is their response to this?" And it was kind of all over the place. So tell us, help us know, like, what is a leftist, and what does that mean?
So I mean, yeah, I picked that word for a reason. Um, and I'm a little bit literal minded about how I use it. You know, the etymology of the terms left wing and right wing, as I understand it, goes back to the period, sort of leading up to the French Revolution, when the way the French Parliament or whatever was set up, the French Assembly or whatever they called it. If you Basically, if you were in favor of the king, if you were in favor of the nobility, the aristocracy, kind of if you were in favor of established power, you sat to the right. And uh, if
Oh,
you
interesting.
and then to the left is a large group of people who did not agree with each other about everything, and who, once the revolution really got going, started fighting with each other, um, fruitlessly and stupidly,
Hmm.
which is that's unfortunately also predictive of many things about leftist history. But whatever they disagreed with, they are all sort of they all sort of agree that there is something fundamentally arbitrary and unjustifiable and even criminal about the hierarchical arrangement of society and the sort of hoarding, not just like like little inequalities, but like total hoarding of wealth and power, by a very small group of people for whom everybody else basically works.
Mm.
And and the reason that I didn't write a book called Why Christians Should Be Socialists or Social Democrats or or anarchists or anything else is because there continue to be many sort of, as we call them, tendencies on the left. I'm not completely persuaded by any of them, and I'm partially persuaded by lots of them. Some of them I think are pretty toxic, but all of them, like, if they still have anything in common, it is that rejection of unjustified hierarchy and of hoarding of wealth and power.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
I do think that we should reject that.
Mm.
And I think it is Christian to reject that. And at least in the West, I'm not sure that the tendency to reject that would ever have evolved had it not been for the kind of um, had Jesus not come, basically.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what I mean by it. And
Mhm.
like the rest, I definitely feel like we can um, we can negotiate about. And there are lots of
Mhm.
things that call themselves left that I would totally reject, just as a lot of what calls itself Christianity I don't want anything to do with either.
Sure. Yeah. So you talk. I'm going to play devil's advocate here a little bit in a way that I'm not actually personally invested in, but I think there's a little voice
Oh man.
caveat. Sorry, but I think there's a little voice in the back of a lot of our listeners' heads that they still sometimes wonder about. Because you talk about in this book, basically the voice says this: isn't this just the same problem, like saying that Christians should be leftist? Isn't that the same problem as what we've got on the right? We've got Make America Great Again, which is all wrapped up in Christian nationalism and all, that kind of a thing. Like, and so this analysis or this kind of devil's advocate voice kind of says something like, so the real problem isn't whether you're left or you're right. The real problem is that Christians are getting too political. They're making an idol out of politics. And so your book talks about the necessity of politics, how we can't avoid being political if we're
Yeah.
going to be Christians that take seriously, the gospel and our need to live together as humans. So maybe just give a little apology for, like, how is what you're advocating for in this book not just sort of MAGA, but for the left?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, as you point out, I just do agree that politics are unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, as for the rest of it, I mean, I've heard this argument before, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you have your leftist Christianity and you have your rightist Christianity, but the real problem is, um, you know, like both of those sets of people are political, and that's
Mm-hmm.
the real problem.
Yeah.
And while I agree that we should not make an idol out of politics any more than we should make an idol out of anything,
Yeah.
and I agree that in practice it's not easy to avoid idolatry of really anything important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I do think I just think the comparison um, of the leftist Christian to the MAGA Christian, it's a little bit like if you had two guys and one of them for breakfast he eats like a sensible bowl of oatmeal, and the other guy for breakfast he eats like just as much arsenic as his mouth can hold. And then you said, uh, okay, look, fundamentally, radically, deep down, these guys are the same because they're both breakfast eaters.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, the content of the politics
Yeah.
that you are advocating for matters like totally and completely. Like
Yes.
there is a radical difference between saying that Christianity should inspire us to do, kindness, justice, and mercy, than saying that Christianity should drive us to like chase our Haitian neighbors away. You
Right.
know, I mean, it's
Right.
the content.
Yeah.
The content is bad. I don't if the question is like, you know, maybe a slightly more refined version of that critique is something like, you know, you're both making the mistake of thinking that the state can be used for good. Now that I can imagine like an anarchist making that argument too, and then you know that
Sure.
would be
That's
like
a
I can
leftist.
yeah,
Yeah.
that is a version of
Yeah.
leftist
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah, that's right.
And you know, of course, Jacques Ellul, who I admire very much, was an anarchist.
Mhm.
And that one's a little harder. I mean, I think
Yeah.
historically, there's lots and lots of places and moments where states have been used for good, and
Yeah.
since I don't know, I guess this is just getting down to like, why aren't I an anarchist then? I mean, you know,
Right.
which is
But
a good question that I have with, you know, a good
yeah.
discussion that I have with anarchists who I know and love. But like,
Yeah.
I do think, I mean, just to keep it simple for this, I do think the state can be used for good, and so I
Yeah.
think let's use it for good. And I
Let's use it
just
for good.
disagree with the MAGA Christians that is what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe to put a just to summarize that, because I think that's really important. That it's, you know, it's possible to make an idol out of breakfast, right? To go back to your analogy.
Yeah.
Yes, sure, it's possible to make an idol out of food, but like the danger here is you know, it's not the idolatry, the potential idolatry. The danger is the poison, the arsenic. You know.
Yeah.
And I think that so often when Christians punt to that sort of like, we shouldn't get too political, politics is an idol, like we shouldn't, when they punt to that, the assumption in the background is that the content of the politics, as you put it, actually doesn't matter that much, or is inconsequential. Like it's almost like we're saying, don't get involved in politics because that's just like, you guys are fighting over the color of the carpet, or what, you know, like what kind of, but I like your point of just bringing us back to the, like, well, let's just examine what these politics are advocating for. You know, is it advocating for the hoarding of wealth and for the, you know, the chasing away of Haitian neighbors, or for the flourishing of all?
Yeah, and that's not the color of the carpet. And
right, exactly.
So a corollary of what I'm saying is that one of the things that I wrote the book for is that I actually think that there are a lot of Christians who won't call themselves Christian leftists, but they basically are at heart, who are great people I really admire. And I'm kind of saying, look, at this, especially at this point, if you you know, if you're doing a canned food drive that like immigrants and refugees are going to eat any of, you know, like if you're doing any of the stuff that promotes like non-hierarchical human flourishing, you know, guess what, you've already picked a side, and you might as well understand that you've done so. And I think it's partly by all of us acknowledging that we do that all the time, and that we can't help doing it. I think admitting that we have a dog in the fight means that, you know, like that kind of flags for us that, oh, that means we need to be careful about turning politics into an idol. It means to be careful to make sure that we're doing our politics Christianly, which then does in part mean, like, you know, not always going totally scorched earth against your enemies, like trying to win, but not trying to destroy them just to destroy them. Even though that gets very tempting. I mean, you would not believe the thoughts and feelings I have when I see Stephen Miller or Tom Homan on the news. Not Trump so much, because his brain's so melted. It's hard to it's hard to feel angry
super
at him.
mad at him.
Yeah, I mean, I probably should be, but you know, it's just he's barely there. But the architects of his and Vance, you know, the architects of his actual politics, I do feel deep rage toward. But you know, it is important to remember that that's a person for whom Christ died.
Right. Well, it's almost like, though, the punting to politics, let's not make politics an idol. They're not actually thinking about those things. They're thinking for you to have a dog in the fight, or for you to care about this, or for you to advocate for certain policies is to make an idol out of politics. When it's like, no, actually making an idol out of politics would be for me to desire to destroy my enemies and to seek to do so rather than advocate for policies that benefit
Yeah,
everybody.
to give that a fealty that I only owe
Yes.
to God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But that's different from just having an opinion.
Yeah, and from having an opinion, and also from like admitting the practical implications that flow from trying to serve God.
Yes.
I mean, God tells us to hang out with people that like a lot of MAGA politicians and pundits want like driven out of their tent cities and driven out of the city square and locked up literally in camps. They're more and more open about that. And to pick on well-heeled liberals for a second, God also tells us to hang out with the very people who like a lot of folks here in Ann Arbor who vote like me also don't want any housing to be built that would eventually lead to a situation where some of those folks could be housed because it'll mess up their property values. So, yeah.
Well, let's chat more about this, Phil, because as I hear you talk, one of the questions that occurs to me, may occur to our listeners, is, well, if you want to take care of the least of these, and you want policies that lead to more human flourishing, and you want to see more equality, less unjust hierarchies, well, that's what the local church is for, right? So this is what I kind of came to faith in, was that politics is a domain of like worldly power, where people are tempted and or do nefarious things to gain power, and the local church is where you help people. So what is insufficient or incomplete about that thinking, and why are you keen on claiming the political sphere as a arena of agency for the Christian life?
Before I answer that, Matt, have you read the book Living Faith by Jacques Ellul?
No, I haven't.
Bro,
I've read some of his stuff on technology. Yeah.
I promise I'm not trying to play like, oh, you read a book that you haven't. I'm mentioning it because I'm very sure that with those sympathies, I'm very sure that you would love that book. He says that politics is literally the devil. It is his position is very different from my position.
Yeah.
That's what the local church is for. Well, okay, so first of all, at this point, it's increasingly clear that the further MAGA gets, the more what we consider the routine and apolitical work of the local church becomes actually quite risky, like in terms of opening yourself up to government persecution and even prosecution. And it becomes illegal. Now, of course, as Christians, we can look at that and say, oh, cool, I get to be a martyr just for doing like the boring works of mercy. Go me. I personally would rather not be martyred. I like my cats, and I'm fond of my wife, and I enjoy watching the TV show King of the Hill after work is done. I don't want to be killed.
Sorry, I just got really. That's one of my favorite TV shows. It is just a fantastic work. So anyway,
I think Luann is right up there with like Chaplin's Little Tramp on the list of just like inexhaustibly funny characters. Yeah, brilliant job. But yeah, so I think sometimes Christian intellectuals, people like me, are apt to like get too hype about the idea of martyrdom in theory, without you got to count the costs and admit how much it would really suck. But okay, fine, yeah. I'm not saying like if it becomes illegal to take care of refugees, if it becomes the kind of thing that gets you sued by the federal government, which has actually happened in the Southwest, you know,
Hmm.
then like, okay, that doesn't mean that we stop doing the work, obviously, but are we doing the work because are we doing that work because it allows us to be like real badass martyrs, or are we doing the work with the hope of it actually feeding people
Right.
and
Hmm.
helping people, you know? So I think just for the church to be the church, we have for the church to be the church with any hope of like really alleviating human suffering, and not
Hmm.
just like doing kind of token illegal charity work that doesn't help very many people because we're getting arrested for it before it can
Yeah.
get off the ground. I think
Mhm.
we have to I think we have to contest politically. I think we have to contest the political arena. But I also I don't know. I mean, I do. It's not like I completely don't have the voice in the back of my head that says those things. I mean, again, you transpose that argument slightly, and you have Christian anarchism, which is something that I can. I mean, I do consider that to be like an example of Christian leftism, and I admire some of those people a lot, you know.
Hmm.
Um, but then I look at the abolitionists who, on the one hand, talk about people who were very, very holy and very committed to the church and to building up the church, and to living separate and set aside lives, but who, on the other hand, like
Hmm.
needed the federal government to get rid of slavery. You know, that like they they saw like a great injustice happening. Um, and I mean, some of those folks were like sort of strategically nihilistic. They thought there was no way to like they thought that they just didn't think that, you know, an Abraham Lincoln would ever come along, or that a civil that you know, the abolitionist side could win a civil war. um you know, some of them took that kind of more separatist approach, but I mean, ultimately, most of them were willing to recognize the gift that was Lincoln when it was handed to them. You know, um, and then I would finally say we should separate questions of like what should I don't know, what should you as an individual Christian be doing from what should all Christians be doing. I mean, if you have that very strong quietist impulse in you that says uh, the secular political sphere can't be saved, but I can do some good at my local church. Um, I don't I don't think that's I don't think much of that ultimately is a political theory of what you know, or what everybody should be doing, but that may be very, very solid vocational advice from the Holy Spirit to you. That may be a very solid indication of what you personally should be doing.
Hmm.
um, and then that means that hopefully God is calling someone else to be the political fighter who keeps you from, you know, being arrested because we've made it illegal to serve the homeless.
Hmm.
Well, Phil, I want to give our listeners, like an appetizer of your book, and you go chapter by chapter and lay out how capitalism makes claims on our time and our
Mhm.
relationships and our agency. I wonder if you can pick one of these, work, people, power, and unpack it a bit for us.
um yeah, well, for the sake of kind of giving people a sense of the flavor of the book, I guess I can talk about work, because that's something that I talk about in the book. I mean, and one of the really probably most sincere parts of the book, I talk about how, like, okay, so I work, my day job is I teach freshman English at the University of Michigan, basically.
Hmm.
Um, and oh my goodness, I love my job. Like one thing I've really held on to from my Calvin College years is like that reformed idea of vocation makes a lot of sense to me. I have had the experience of falling into work um, that I can happily give all of my energy to, and completely exhaust myself and not know that I'm doing it, because it is just so deeply like where, Frederick Buechner says, where my deep joy and the world's deep hunger meets, or whatever the quote is.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm real earnest about my job, and I have these really deep beliefs about how education, um, the the wealth of human history and culture and languages and art and literature should be shared with everybody and made accessible to everybody. And you know what? I get up every day and I go to work at a place that um, kind of justifies itself as an institution in part by hoarding and rationing excellence. um, and by making these a kind of luxury good that we can charge crazy out of state tuition for, you know um like we I think God has I don't think God has made it so that everybody can be a great composer, for example, but I think God has made it so that everybody can be pretty good at something. Everybody has some role to play. And what our society does is to kind of turn excellence, is to create an artificial scarcity of excellence, so that excellence can be, you know sorted and rationed and
Mm.
sold at a premium. And I'm among the lesser paid, at least at University of Michigan. I mean, I get a much better deal than most lecturers, most places, but I am among the lesser paid winners in that system, and that's how I make my bones. Most of my work, uh, it, like only my students benefit from it. And it's not that I don't want my students to benefit from it, because like I love my kids. My kids are delightful. But my preference would be to be working, whatever talents I have, turning them to the good of a much socioeconomically like larger set of people. And that's just, as long as I'm working at the University of Michigan, that is in fact not what I'm going to be doing. Um, and I can't really control that. That's a thing that like I can't personal righteousness my way out of, you know
Yeah.
or like that's an example of a decision that is being made for me by a social structure. um and I can do certain things to try and cut against the logic of all that, and I do a couple of writing workshops, creative writing workshops at Upper Peninsula prisons every summer. But that's like 2 days out of my year. I can't uh, like I can't do that all the time, because I'd miss my classes and I wouldn't get paid.
Right.
Right. So if I really wanted, to be like making a making some kind of living wage, educating like a, a larger subset of the human race, I have to think about how we can change structures.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't, I mean, that's, you know, all of us have jobs, not because we woke up individually and thought, sorted through our options and thought, I think the best way for me to live would be to rely on wages for, you know what I mean? Like this is
Yeah.
just, everybody needs one of these because this is how the whole world works,
Yep.
And so,
Hmm.
I think it's oftentimes we don't think about it like that, that it's like, oh, that's actually capitalism laying claim on my time. And there's an implicit threat, right? It's
Yeah.
like,
This
that's
is
there.
starvation.
So, yep.
This is
Yep.
starvation.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
and that's another thread of the book's argument is that I think most Americans sort of implicitly accept the idea that the only way to get people to work is to threaten them with
Yeah.
starvation.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't really think that's true. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think that's true of most people. Let's put it
Sure.
that way. I
Sure.
mean, there's
Yeah.
always outliers. And there's always people who have been like deeply, deeply institutionalized, right? Like when I
Right.
worked at a homeless shelter, um, most of the clients, of course, worked. In fact, many of them worked harder than I did. Many of them worked 2 jobs and then slept for 6 hours on a. You wouldn't believe how thin these mats were. It was so dystopian. But I did meet one or two guys who'd be like, "Yep, I don't have to work. I just come here and I get my free meal." And like they
Yeah.
would almost say it like a brag. And I'm like, according to the capitalist theory of work, that's all of us deep down, and we have to
Yeah.
be goaded into not being
Yeah.
those guys.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but that's not all of us deep down. That's probably two incredibly institutionalized guys who maybe have been through mental hospitalization or multiple cycles of imprisonment and have no trust in their own agency.
Right.
And like that's not the natural
Mhm.
state of human beings, and that's not our natural attitude toward work. That's something people have to be almost brutalized into, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
I think that's right.
yeah, so I don't share the fear that um yeah that people have to be
Hmm.
sort of jolted into making themselves useful.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the desire to be, and this, I'm not saying human beings are inherently loving and beautiful and virtuous and sinless. I believe in original sin as
Hmm.
strongly as anybody does, but I think even our egotism plays a role in that desire to work. I mean,
Sure. Yeah.
we want
Yeah.
to be seen to be contributing. We
Hmm.
want to be seen to be important. And I think,
Yeah.
you look at all the people who uh, are making who are motivated to keep making more money even though they don't have time to spend all of it. I mean, it's obvious that ego is driving most of that.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so many different directions we could take this, but I wonder if we can talk about enemies. You end the book with a chapter on naming enemies. At the time of this recording, we're actually in the middle of a book club right now where we're reading Melissa Flora Bixler's book, How to
Hmm.
Have an Enemy.
Yeah,
And so,
I'm glad somebody wrote about that. I was excited when I saw that title. I haven't read the book yet, but
yes, yeah, the book is excellent, and it really does, man, it really names very clearly so many of the ways that we get this wrong. But in terms of, anyway, what it means to actually have an enemy, and then what it means to love that enemy.
hmm,
I think we either emphasize the enemy or the love, but it's hard to hold them together. But
yeah.
you say in your book that anyone who is moving leftward is going to have to start to name enemies. And I wonder if you can double click on that for us. Like, what's the
Yeah.
connection for you between being a leftist, a Christian leftist, and naming enemies?
Well, I think this gets back to the stuff we were talking about earlier. I think part of what people are saying when they say, "Oh, Christians are getting too political," and that's what the problem is it's. I think sometimes that's a very justifiable, like, reluctance to have and name enemies.
Mm,
It's like I
yes.
I don't want to have to. I don't know. I don't want to have to think of the people who are supporting some of these policies that we're seeing, as I don't want to have to be mad at them. you know, I
Yeah.
don't, and I don't want to have to. Yeah, I definitely don't want to have more fights at Thanksgiving with the family. I don't want to have to think bad things about people I love. Like, I I don't want to start being one of these off-putting people who gets like so angry when he sees Peter Thiel that
Mhm.
people like me, uh, that he starts ranting like a maniac. I don't want to be one of those people.
Yeah.
And that like that's understandable to me because, you know, most of the time when people have enemies, they hate them. You know, that's just what
Yes.
we naturally do.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, that's why we need God to enter history and tell us to do something else.
Yeah.
You know, that
Yeah.
that's like the easily the most unnatural part of Christ's message to me. Um,
Mm.
but I just think it's just part of our acknowledging reality to admit that it, you know, if
Mm.
something is wrong and someone is in favor of it, then there are three possibilities. One, it's you who's wrong.
Mhm.
Two, they are deluded in some way. Or three, there is at least some degree of malevolence in them. And I think with, you know, when I think about my own relatives who have MAGA tendencies, I think it's a lot of like it starts as it starts as like they they're kind of bamboozled by some particular thing, but I don't know,
Mhm.
by the time you're I don't think anybody in my family has regressed to this point yet, but by the time you're like on social media sharing images of like women being brutalized by ICE and you're like laughing about it, like
Yeah.
maybe you started um on this path because you believed someone who was ill, who had bad intentions, but by the time you're that far along, and that's a like a lot of people are there,
Yep.
you know, there's you have tolerated and nursed a certain amount of evil in your heart,
Yes.
you know.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's not fun to say that stuff. And of course, acknowledge acknowledging someone as an enemy also means like, you know, it could mean that the first of my three options are wrong. I mean, admitting you have conflict with someone else also means like admitting that you have a position,
Yeah.
and your position could be wrong, and so
Mhm.
that could be embarrassing.
Yeah.
So it just entails risk all around. But
Mm.
I think we have to, I think if we can't take even those sort of private and mostly emotional risks of acknowledging I have a position and acknowledging that other people want something that is the opposite of what I think is good, and that one of us is wrong, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think if we can't take those risks, then we certainly won't be able to take the kinds, you know, any other risks
Right.
in making those positions happen. And I
Mhm.
think you just you got to do it. And but then the other thing, so my answer to this question is kind of going to parallel my answer to the earlier question. I think part of the reason to admit, you know, part of the reason to get political, or admit that you already have a politics, is that then, you know, you can acknowledge to yourself, okay, well, I also, in the process of having these politics and fighting for them in whatever way I can, that that also flags for me that you know, I could yield to the temptation to turn this into an idol. And in
Yeah.
the same way, it's actually easier to make a point of not giving into hatred of somebody,
Mhm.
you know, not giving into like just mindless opposition to somebody if you acknowledge to yourself that they're your enemy. I mean, I don't
Right.
know if you've ever seen, I feel like this frequently happens within like church politics, meaning like vestry meetings and the like. Um, or you know, missionary, you know, missionary club support meetings or whatever, the ladies missionary committee their
Yeah.
meetings, right? Or that's what they called it when I was a kid. um have you ever seen two people who are obviously like really mad at each other and are obviously like just ideologically cut from different cloth, and they always fight with each other, but because they know each other through church, so they have to pretend that they like
Yeah.
each other, and so they won't admit that they have beef,
Right.
that they won't admit that they're enemies. I mean, some of the most vicious, nasty, knockdown, dirty fighting I've ever seen that didn't like draw physical blood was in those kinds of situations where people
Yeah.
are like licensing themselves to use all kinds of dishonest strategies because, oh, it's not like I'm really fighting with this person. This is sister so and so, and we're good friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I I think in a lot of situations, people would actually like check themselves a little bit more if they allowed themselves to admit, yeah, so and so's my enemy.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So and so is my enemy, and therefore a person Christ told me I have to pray for, and I have to turn them the
Right.
other cheek when they hit me. Oh, darn it! I suddenly have all these duties toward them, Whereas 2 minutes ago we were friends, and so that meant I could do whatever the heck I wanted.
Oh man,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting.
I'm glad you touched on that, Phil. I think that oftentimes we have allergies or anxieties about having enemies. But that often just, first of all, I think if we can make that choice, it's an indication that you've got an extreme amount of privilege. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
Secondly, I think also too, there is a cultural anxiety to people not liking us in white culture, especially in white affluent culture, and h- acknowledging that you have an enemy means that there's some enmity
Mhm.
between me and another person, and we just don't like. I mean, unless we're sort of prone to rancor,
Mm.
we
Yeah.
don't like that.
I think I think there's a class dimension to it as well because
Yeah.
I don't know, working class white kids fought. um, I lost so many fights in grade school and middle school.
Mm.
I won like two, and it felt really bad actually. I mean,
Mhm.
a little bit of actual conflict is a good teacher, like that.
Mm.
Yeah, why you shouldn't romanticize conflict too much. But yeah, I agree. Like I ugh, ever since I reached like an age and a level of privilege and an income bracket where like you know people invite me to volunteer with this or that committee or be on this or that governing board. I've seen the results of what you're talking about play out over and over again.
Hmm.
And I mean, not only is it often interpersonally destructive, the maintenance of the pretense that we're all buddy buddy here, while we kind of conceal, while we do behind the scenes warfare on each other. But it's also just as a person, as a writer, as someone who likes folks to just say what they mean and make their points clear and make clear what their place in the argument is. It's so incredibly obfuscating.
Mm.
I find nothing more obfuscating than like, yeah, two well-heeled folks um, continually changing the stated reasons for why they're going to vote this way on this motion or whatever, um,
Yeah.
because the actual reasons are like would require them to name a conflict or something I see as an educator. Actually, this is kind of a weird example, but I found textbooks incredibly hard to read and understand when I was a kid and a college student. And much later figured out that it was always because the writers of textbooks on like humanities, social science, hard sciences, whatever, they always try to narrate disagreements between schools of thought in the most neutral and like Olympian sounding tone possible, right?
Mhm.
And so um because the authors can't disclose that they're more sympathetic to that school, that's this school of thought rather than that school of thought, you never actually get a clear like indication of why this personality, why this group of personality theorists hates this group of personality theorists, or why this school of psychology differs from this school of psychology, because everybody's giving a polite obfuscating explanation of it. And I found this like actively inimical to me learning anything. And then I discovered that people who write a little bit polemically, um, I can learn anything I want from them, you know?
Yeah.
Well, Phil, maybe as we wrap up here, could you, as you think about, as you try to inhabit this political theology in the public sphere as a Christian and as a teacher, is there anything? And I know this is talking about the left is a bit about talking about the right. You'll find some variety here, but I'm just curious
Oh,
if there's aspects of being a leftist or things that maybe people who also use that phrase claim that you find that don't align with your faith.
oh,
Um,
sure. Well, I mean, I'm not a Marxist Leninist for what I hope are pretty obvious reasons. Um, yeah, and I mean, I talk about this in the book, um, you know, quite a bit. But so for one thing, I think one of the least helpful things that happens on the left is people getting really hung up on figuring out which political strategies or ideas are revolutionary versus which ones are reformist, so that they can always be the first thing and not the second thing.
Right.
I mean, I think that's fruitless. One, because you often don't know in advance. So there are people, for example, who think who kind of discount the abolitionists as leftists because, you know, ultimately it was just a reform movement. You know, it made one little change to capitalism. One little change. You can't buy and sell humans anymore. You know, one tiny change. Um, and I think, boy, when you look at I'm one of these people who thinks Reconstruction and the New Deal are like basically good, and we must return. Um, but you look at some of the stuff that was happening under Reconstruction. You know, you read Frederick Doug. Ugh, what an idiot I am. You read Du Bois's book about it. Uh, and you know, or Eric Foner's book about it, and you're like, well, this was a lost paradise. You know, why did my eighth grade, you know, American history teacher lie to me about how great Reconstruction was? But you know, so I think that was revolutionary. I think getting rid of slavery was a revolutionary change, if revolution means, you know, a fundamental overturning of things and a fundamental change to the structure of society. And I think that's why America spent like 50 to 80 years afterwards, like undoing it. It was too much for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But along with that, I think as a Christian, you really shouldn't be super gung ho about war. Practically speaking, revolutions, I mean, people don't always use the word to mean a literal military revolution, but they often mean that. And I think a lot of leftists are way too sanguine about how that would go, and they put way too much of their hope in some future, you know, one and done, incredibly violent and brutal conflict that will, you know, but once it happens, we can have paradise. I think that pattern of thinking, it's, it's not uh, it's not exclusive to the left, and it's also not like, you don't have to think that way to be a leftist, obviously. But I think there's way too much of it, and yeah, I don't. I find that really, um, ugh, it's hard to even say how turned off I am by it. I really deeply distrust that stuff.
The book again is called Why Christians Should Be Leftists. Phil, tell us where we can find you out on the internet. And I know you have a Substack.
Yeah. Boy, now I'm second guessing myself if it's Philip Christman or Philip. I think it's philipchristman.substack.com, 1L in Philip. And the Substack is called The Tourist for reasons that have to do with a private joke between me and two other friends that I don't even remember the details of anymore. It's been called that for so long. Yeah, I mean, that's the main place that I am. And I'm also on Twitter Methadone, otherwise known as Blue Sky.
Thanks again for joining us, Phil.